Welcome back, everyone. Apologies for the spectrum interference here, which appears to be bisecting me at the moment. In the last 2 days, we've heard about unlicensed in 6 gigahertz, about challenges of accessing spectrum in rural areas, and earlier today about CBRS and other mid-band spectrum management issues. But taking things up a notch, now we're going to listen to Dan Rabinovitz, Vice President at Facebook, to talk about how spectrum policy is evolving in general. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Steve. Great. I am Dan Rabinovitz, and I support a group in Facebook called Facebook Connectivity, and our focus is on bringing more people online to a faster internet. And very importantly, we're also, through our efforts in the Telecom Infra Project, for example, quite focused on the transformation of the mobile industry, really to look at ways that we can drive down the cost, the efficiency of how we operate networks, and reach populations that are today quite challenged. So we have a significant amount of our work focused on business models that we can then share with the rest of the industry. And today I'd like to talk about how spectrum policy fits into all of those items. So next slide, please. I think framing up the problem is really helpful. And I want to point out that the 500 million rural residents that we believe are underconnected in emerging markets, that's only with respect to the 10 countries that we looked at. We actually think this number is probably closer to 1 billion. In other words, 2 times this size. But if you just look at the population that we analyzed, 25% of the people have no data coverage, and so they either have 2G or they have no coverage at all. 25% of that population are what we call low speed but online, so they have slow 3G or 4G connections, less than 1.5 megabits per second. And then there are what we call, either the covered poor or late adopters. These are 45% of that population who are covered but offline. And really, the challenge there is more that they're not aware of the availability of internet access, or they can't actually bridge the affordability gap. And that could be device affordability, which is an area that we're also quite interested in, and of course service affordability. And then 5%, the lucky 5%, are actually on high-speed connections. So really the vast majority of these rural populations are underconnected or unconnected. Next slide, please. Now, one of the biggest, it's quite obvious that rural business cases are the most complex to close. And the reasons are varied, and there's never just one thing that conspires to make this difficult for operators. It's a very, very challenging business and let's say operational environment that you have to overcome. What are these difficult environments? Well, first of all, if you have a remote population that's relatively low density, that means that the revenue for that area is going to be quite low, which means that you'll never close the business case. If you have to bring backhaul to that region and you have a very small population and they don't pay very much, this is the reason why so many areas have just continued to remain unconnected, because it's not economically viable to put a sustainable network there. Additionally, there's minimal infrastructure investment, and that means there may not be adequate electricity, there may not be adequate roads to pull expensive equipment. Getting towers out and constructed in some of these areas is actually challenging. There's always a capital constraint because, again, coming back to overcoming the overall business case, you have to really watch your pennies. How much money are you investing in capital to connect these locations? And then here's the strange thing: you might have a very remote area, but with very dense population. And we see this quite a bit across all emerging markets. We find places that may be hundreds of miles from an urban center or a fiber point of presence, but then there are thousands of people that are living actually relatively in close proximity. So you have the problem that you need to actually bring a fair bit of capacity backhaul capacity to these regions to be able to connect them adequately. So there's, we always say that rural is actually a much more complex market than people give it credit for. And we've gone through multiple classifications in our own analysis of ultra rural, rural, the exurban, suburban types of populations, just trying to figure out like how to get business models to close in these varied settings. Okay, so next slide, please. So why is spectrum important in all this? First of all, it's very clear that in these areas, licensed spectrum is lying fallow, right? So one of the easiest things to do when you look at spectrum regulation is to say, hey, if licensed spectrum is not being used in an area, particularly an area where a mobile operator might have a build-out obligation as part of their license, then it's really logical to allow for someone else to use that spectrum in that limited area in order to basically close the business case. And there's good reasons for actually taking advantage of the licensed spectrum, because that means device distribution, which will support those bands, the availability of handsets and other devices, all should be much easier to manage, and because those are licensed bands that are already in use by the operator. There's also the potential here to take advantage of shared spectrum, and it gives policymakers an opportunity to tap into that potential, which can also create more sustainable business models that encourages more participation. And I'll talk more about this, but the idea of sharing can come in various ways. Sometimes to just bridge the coverage gap, but sometimes importantly to come as a follow-up and bridge the capacity gap, which is why mid-band spectrum becomes so attractive for, let's say, the chess moves and the evolution of some of these areas. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about sharing, because sharing spectrum is part of an overall trend towards sharing everything. And this whole idea about shared infrastructure just makes the investment more viable. You can get to a sustainable business case over years if you make a commitment not to overbuild in these rural areas. And we see, like, there's a challenge right now, and we can see it in the 5G world. In some markets, mobile operators are actually overbuilding on top of each other in urban areas. A good example is 5G millimeter wave. You see multiple operators building right on top of each other, and it's expensive. All of that fiber, all of the site locations, electricity, the overall OpEx and CapEx cost is being borne by each operator. When you get to a rural area, there's no way that you can ever find a business case that would sustain that. And that's why we've been so focused on shared infrastructure. This allows for you to build one network and serve many operators. So think of this really as a wholesale play. You're reducing the cost for the operators, you're enabling a much more affordable service for consumers, and you make it possible for more operators to offer let's say their visible brand on a device in more areas, because they're not having to shoulder the burden uniquely of building out that infrastructure. What does it mean? Using shared towers, using shared backhaul resources. Sometimes that backhaul is satellite, depending on the remoteness of the area. The running of the network, all the operations and engineering, that shared OpEx actually helps a ton, because everything counts here. Selecting the lowest cost billing systems, the lowest cost of operation, all of that contributes to a sustainable business case. And here and today, like, what we would like to challenge everyone is to start thinking of shared spectrum as a natural part of building a rural network that is taking advantage of everything else that's shared. So let's go to the next slide, please. The wholesale model increases the potential to invest widely. So when you really look at a wholesale idea, we're actually talking about a network as a service. This is turning the idea of operating a network into an OpEx and rather than kind of the traditional model. And by doing that, you can really develop a partnership around the capitalization of these entities that is more of a public-private kind of model. So if we look at something like Internet para Todos, which was one of our first adventures into this game, what we were really trying to figure out is, can we drive sustainability by building common technology stack, getting common backend systems and tools, and empowering the local operators to lower their capex for the mobile operators to offer service. So think of it this way: Internet para Todos is a rural network. All of its assets are shared, and the incumbent mobile operators in Peru, where IPT is located, are able to offer service making use of that network and all of its assets. But it's all shared. So every time a new operator comes on board, the costs for everybody effectively go down, which is excellent, right? So if you have a competitive landscape for the majority of a country, and you're really trying to bridge that gap to the rural communities, this is a way to do that at a sustainable cost. And make no mistake, IPT is going to be a for-profit company, and they will clear profit because this model can work in the real world. Now, part of this is we bring in development banks to offer up capital. The existing mobile operators also can invest. And what we hope to see is scale around this, because we don't want to be involved in, Facebook itself will participate in some trials and getting a few of these things off the ground to kind of prove the model. But ultimately, the true test is that banks and existing mobile operators partnering with regulators and policymakers will actually make this scale around the world. And that means that the regulatory framework has to be quite well thought through to protect everybody's interests, including the mobile operators and the people who are going to be taking advantage of these networks. And then you have this really interesting option now to have access to spectrum that is not only potentially borrowing some of the licensed spectrum that's not in use there, but also creating a tranche of spectrum that is specifically used for these wholesale rural network as a service companies. And I think you can imagine, if you've been unconnected to the internet and you get connected, very quickly you could say, oh, well, those people are going to be delighted with something around 3 to 5 megabits per second, because if you have nothing and then the next day you have something, the something seems awesome. But as we all know, that's just not the way the market evolves. And witness the way we've evolved in dense urban areas and in developed markets. Hey, we've gone to basically all-you-can-eat data consumption, which continues to just grow and grow and grow. So if you look at the trend line, as soon as you get these communities connected, the next thing you have to start thinking about is capacity. And if you want more capacity, obviously you have to deal with increasing the size of the backhaul, but you also need to think about spectrum in a very thoughtful way. And here's a great example for having mid-band shared spectrum that could be brought into use as these communities reach a certain density and scale, and the sustainability of the network grows. Now you can bring in something in the 3.5 gigahertz range, which obviously just builds up the potential for more capacity in these areas. It's a subtle point, but it's important, because we should not think about rural communities as somehow communities that should be disadvantaged forever. Once we get them connected, it's really our job to make sure that they're connected just the same way as everybody else. So we're bringing opportunity to these areas in the same sense that we would any other community. Okay, so next slide, please. So basically, it's documented quite well that connectivity and broadband drives economic development and GDP. So these are good things to do for communities and for countries' normal policy. And because spectrum sharing is something that can accelerate the deployment of connectivity and broadband for both underserved rural areas as well as capital-constrained urban areas, I think we just need to do some work as an industry to answer this question. Can the economic and GDP value of connectivity acceleration outweigh the value of auction spectrum for a country? It's a very sensitive topic. You know, even in our recent experience with CBRS, the PAL licenses generated a significant amount of revenue for the United States, and you know, in the order of $4 billion for spectrum that was really earmarked for sharing. And then the remainder, what will be general available access, right, is effectively free to use spectrum. It's shared. So I think there's some real work that needs to get done here, and it's important for us in the industry to be able to go to markets and basically say to regulators and policymakers, hey, there is value here. You could reserve a tranche or a portion of spectrum that you might have put up for auction and reserve it for sharing. And that reserve actually will drive GDP as fast as or more than the revenue that you would bring in just for a classic licensed auction. So we don't know the answer to this yet, but I think it is a call to action for all of us in this shared spectrum game to actually start putting together a hypothesis around this and trying to find a way to generate answers and metrics so that this could actually be something that more countries could start to adopt. And it's important because you cannot make this argument without data, and it really does have a significant impact on the way people would think about their precious resource, which is, the scarce resource of spectrum is always highly contested. And so I think this is an important thing that we need to pull together for the industry. All right, so in conclusion, my last slide is basically, hey, let's use this power of smart spectrum policy to connect everyone. There's so much to unlock here. And given the fact that we're starting to use shared infrastructure in rural communities already, you could very quickly imagine that shared spectrum becomes a natural part of that. And then, what we've seen now with the emergence of CBRS is that this also has a big impact on the private networks. It will have an impact in dense urban areas. So, I think at long last, the DSA's focus on sharing spectrum and finding ways to take fallow spectrum and make good use of it is really coming to the fore for the industry in a way that maybe we would not have imagined 10 years ago. So it's an exciting time to be involved in all of this, and I look forward to partnering with many of you to make the future brighter for us.
Thank you very much, Dan. Just one quick question, I think, before we close. I think you really hit on a point of tension there, the issue of auctions and the extent to which auctions enable the market and close the market. And certainly in my area of research, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that, not only are auctions not sort of necessarily increasing competition dramatically, but they're actually locking out the smaller operators, and we see this wealth of new technologies for smaller operators, but there is that kind of barrier to getting there. But it's not clear. The approach such as CBRS that has been taken in the U.S. is the product of an industrialized economy, and for smaller countries, smaller regulators, what do you think the best way forward is?
Well, I think we need to come with data, and I agree with you that the way CBRS worked in the United States, it's not obvious that you can make the same kind of thing happen in sub-Saharan Africa and many of the countries there, nor in Latin America or APAC. Right? It's not totally obvious that the same model would work, but I could very easily see the potential, even if it were a smaller reserve, something to prove out the hypothesis that you could accelerate, for example, the transition from 2G to 4G in underserved areas by just reserving, a 40 to 80 megahertz chunk of mid-band spectrum, for example. Those are the kinds of things that I think we just have to pursue, the ability to experiment and to build up a convincing caseload of data that we can then share with regulators. Nothing else will persuade them. And frankly, it's very understandable. Auctioning spectrum is a very predictable way to bring revenue into the country's coffers. And what we're talking about is a kind of out of the box idea, which is to say, hey, you know what, whatever revenue you would generate there, if I integrate over the curve of 10 years, if you give me 100 megahertz of that or 200 megahertz of that, I will show you that I can bring your GDP up, more, and it will overcome whatever benefit that you thought you would get from the auction. And we just haven't, put that together as an industry. And until we do, I think it's going to be very difficult to persuade regulators. But I think intuitively, we know in the industry how powerful that would be. And, without going into a lot of detail, we see that there are mobile operators in sub-Saharan Africa today that are contemplating a transition from 2G to 3G. And the question I have is, why are we not thinking of Africa as an opportunity to leapfrog? Why should Africa have to go through all of the, I would even call them the mistakes that we've made in the rest of the world? We should be thinking about how do we accelerate, Africa, certainly skip 3G, which is not an awesome technology. I have a bias that all odd Gs are less awesome than Gs. LTE, densified LTE is pretty awesome. And I think, it's just one of these things where we need to create a bunch of case studies that kind of show what happens to communities if you take them from a voice-only 2G kind of environment. Okay, yes, Edge and GPRS are data, but it's just hard to even put that into modern context anymore, right? It's just too slow. And going to a proper IP-based network like 4G, densifying that, showing what the results would be in some of these communities, I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Martha has asked whether you could comment a little bit on the importance of 6 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi 6 usages and other wireless devices.
Yeah, I mean, I am a huge Wi-Fi proponent. I refer to Wi-Fi as the atomic building block of connectivity. So it's absolutely an essential ingredient for everything that we believe in Facebook in terms of getting people onto the internet affordably. And 6 gigahertz is just so it's one of the best things that's happened to the industry, I think, in the past 5 to 10 years, that we now see the 6 gigahertz is effectively going to be a superhighway for Wi-Fi. The fact that there's no beaconing there, and you have beaconing on 2.4 and 5, and then once you get onto 6 gigahertz, you're really you're flying in terms of throughput. The other thing that I really like, so if we separate kind of the client side and the network side, the thing that's attractive about the network side for 6 gigahertz is anything that's using mesh today, you're kind of either splitting the 5 gigahertz band, which has a bunch of complexity there. DFS channels are still, not. It's always a challenge to make use of those. With 6, now we really see this potential to build what I call a very fat backhaul pipe for Wi-Fi. So the mesh angle, I think, is really, really cool, because you can use 2.4 and 5 for access. Let's call 2.4 as a tough band, but it's still used widely in many markets. But now at 6, you can build a very, very big backhaul pipe for all these mesh applications. So I think that's like one of the things I'm particularly excited about for networking. The other piece is, 5 gigahertz is actually getting congested in some markets. It's a fact. And by creating this opportunity now to, take advantage of things like, 160 megahertz channels for real. Like when it came out with 11AC, I myself was quite skeptical. Like there's there's not that much spectrum. You can get like 4 bands, maybe. Once you get to 6, like the potential to start using these really wide channels is much more credible. In which case, everybody's user experience on the client side can get a lot better. So yeah, 6 gigahertz is amazing, and I hope we take full advantage of it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and for your talk, and looking forward to more innovations from Facebook. With that brings us to the close of today's summit, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, virtually seeing you, and exciting things tomorrow. The head of the FCC, Ajit Pai, will be joining us. We will have Ofcom speaking. We'll be hearing experiences from around the world of practical experiences of sharing spectrum while protecting incumbents, looking at how corporate social responsibility can promote a more connected world, and also, of course, looking ahead to WRC 23 and what's on the agenda. So thank you very much for joining us today, and see you tomorrow.